categories of sources of pollution referred to as point source and non-point source. What is the difference? Like a pipe.
Yeah, one's
Okay,
memorable.
good. And what's non-point? More diffuse, like a field or a street. Okay, good. Excellent. Okay, so let's look at this model now. Let's start with point sources.
Okay.
What point sources do we see here?
Cars.
What?
Oh, a storm drain. Aha, very good.
Wow. That's what it was meant to be.
The factory.
What happened? Something, I'm just going to lift this up for a minute. Somebody do me a favor. Oh, no, I can't do that now. Never mind. Never
You
mind.
were thinking of snow water all
There
over
used to be a tube.
the other end of the
Yeah,
thing is gone.
so anyway, we're not going to get to see that in action too much. Anyway, so yes, storm drain is a point source. What other point sources?
Factory.
It's factory. Excellent. Did you say
Good job, Jacob.
sewage treatment plant? I heard somebody say that. Here's a sewage treatment plant. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Looks like we have 3 sources of 3-point source pollutants. Yeah, we could call the cow a point source, couldn't we?
Yeah, what about the cars?
We'll get to that in a minute.
Mew-mews.
That's a non-point source. Okay, so let's start with our factory. It used to be, before the Clean Water Act was passed many years ago, used to be that factories got away with murder in terms of dumping stuff in the water. Somebody grabbed that squirt bottle, and who wants to be, that's soy sauce and water. Who wants to be the factory polluter? Okay, so you can just pump a little water in that hole.
Good job. Oh, God. Focus, man.
Let it rip.
Keep
Don't be
going, Jacob.
bashful.
Keep going.
You have to pee a lot.
Come on, Jacob, go.
Okay, good. Now it's, okay, that's good. Perfect. Okay, our beautiful, clean creek has now been
Murdered.
destroyed. Okay, so point source coming out of a pipe. Very good. Who would like to be the sewage treatment plant operator? Don't be bashful. Step right up. Grab that squirt bottle. So,
Where are you going?
before you start. So,
Let Riley do.
So sewage treatment plants usually work in a way that they're designed to put effluent back into the water. So they're getting sewage water, they're treating it, and the treated water is what's coming out of the sewage treatment plants. But one of the other big problems with some sewage treatment plants is they overflow sometimes. And that's when you really get a lot of shit coming down the river, okay? Excuse that term. But anyway, the story of sewage treatment plants is a really good story, actually. So if we were to look, let's say, pretend that I'm holding up a graph. And one line is showing the volume of water coming out of the sewage treatment plants that are on the Patuxent River. That line looks like this. It goes up over time. And then the other line is how much nutrient load is coming out of those sewage treatment plants. That line is going like this. So the technology that we've developed for sewage treatment plants is removing a huge amount of the nutrient now. So it's a huge success story. Okay, Mr. Polluter, let's see you overflow those sewage treatment tanks. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Beautiful. Awesome. Okay. Another point source. Came right directly from one location. Now, I don't know if this one's going to work because it's supposed to.
We'll fake it.
I don't think.
Put your
Yeah.
finger on it.
Okay, so some guy changes his oil in his car, and he takes it and he dumps it. He dumps it down this storm drain, and this is, unfortunately, there should be a little tube here, but when I put it back together, I messed up. So you can just squirt it coming out of that storm drain.
Oh, dang.
Okay, so his oil makes its way into the, it's starting to get into the lake. Okay, now, I think we've covered all the point sources.
Yes.
Now, the fun begins. So, what we have here, we have a couple different things to sprinkle on. See all these brown areas?
Yeah.
These brown areas are exposed soil, exposed dirt, if you will. So, we have this wonderful chili powder that we can, let's put that on the farm field. And then we have that lovely cocoa powder. Let's put that on the forest. It's okay. You're good. You're good. Don't need much more there. See, you're just cut her off. Cut her off.
Seniors, man.
Okay, we need some on the construction side. Let somebody else do it. You're dangerous.
Watch, you're gonna do it like jump it.
And then we need some on this stream bank that they cut down. And
Why'd you do that? Just do
Some
it.
in a little like
Chill.
factory. There's
We're gonna make it rain.
yeah, we got the factory stuff coming out.
there's
The embankment. Yeah, I think we're
You're
good.
doing great.
We're doing good.
China.
Okay, now we get to make it rain.
Oh, I want to make it rain.
Who wants to make it
Come
rain?
here.
Freshies.
You got it, Riley. Don't spray
Oh,
it.
no.
Make it rain.
Go.
Okay, so we can start on the embankment. You're good. I don't think you need to change that. It was already. You were upside down.
No, I can put it in my eyeball.
Try it on your hand. There you go. There you go. You need a lot of rain to get that stuff to come down.
It's not going.
Squirt, boy.
Buddy.
I'm not shooting. I'm not.
Squirt.
Oh, right there, get off of it.
So you got a monitor.
Yeah, he can figure it out. Good, good, good.
You spray me in the face, Riley, and see how it goes. We'll see how you get home. Or if you do get home.
Okay, so look,
Chili and hot cocoa.
this is running down the street and
Yeah, get there.
we'll end up in the storm drain.
Spray right here.
I want chocolate. Hot chocolate.
It's okay. It's called a hurricane. Yeah, true.
Okay, so that's good, that's good, that's good, that's
It's called a
good.
hurricane.
So let's look what we have so far.
I wet counter. Look at this.
It's not a mess. It's all part of the real world. Uh-oh, we just lost another tree.
Hurricane.
Y'all just think, why y'all keep killing the tree?
Hurricane Chrissy.
I did nothing.
Okay,
Shut up.
so let's look at this construction site.
Give it to me.
Here, I'll take that. Thank you.
Thank you, my turn.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're annoying me.
Okay, kids. Let's look at this construction site. You won't find a construction site for many, many years that doesn't have a silt fence around it. That one doesn't. It should. Okay? So, this today would have a silt fence that would prevent a lot of that dirt from running down the roads into the storm drain that would eventually get into the river. Okay, so next, the stream bank. That stream bank has exposed dirt on part of it. What could we do there? Oh, look, I have this lovely piece of felt. We could put a buffer strip that would keep the sediment on that embankment and keep it from running down into the stream. Okay, so how about this hillside that we've cut down most of the trees on this hillside? Is that a good idea?
Yeah, plant
Nah.
some grass.
Nah. I mean, I know we need trees for toilet paper and things like that, but they do things in a bad way.
Let's leave the hills.
And nowadays, when foresters go in and even when they clear cut, they leave a buffer of trees all along any sort of stream or creek or body of water. So granted, clear cutting is pretty destructive, but at least they're trying to protect the waterways still by leaving that buffer strip. Okay, so look at that embankment, it's just bare dirt. So when it rains, obviously a lot of that sediment, and there's probably probably not a lot of nutrients, but there is a lot of sediment that's going to get in there. Okay, and one more thing that we could have done that we didn't. Actually, let's talk about this one next. So notice the chili powder. This was sediment, heavy duty sediment. So it reacted a little bit differently than some of the other soil types, if you will. So look at this farm now. What could this farmer have done to help protect some of that soil and nutrient from getting into the water body? Yes, sir.
So at the end, you could have plowed the opposite way, stop the flow into the.
True. Very true. That's a great observation. And one other thing too. Nowadays, you will not find a farm that's bordering the estuary that does not have a buffer strip around the field. It's a law. They have to leave trees. And what good does it serve to cut down trees? It's not going to impact the amount of farmland that you have, really. I mean, you're going to leave a small buffer strip. But yeah, the plowing's a good one. The buffer strip's another. And then last but not least, to keep those cows from pooping and peeing in the water, you might want to put a fence. Might want to put a fence up to keep them from getting in. So, let's see, what else? Let's see, there's a couple other things that we need to talk about. One other big source of nutrient pollution we haven't talked about that's on here. What is that? Yes. So how do cars pollute the water? I understand how they pollute the air, but how do they pollute the water?
Oil in the drips on the road.
Drips, yep. What is the byproduct of burning fossil fuels?
Antifreeze.
How about something with the N?
Nitrogen.
Nitrous oxide. That's another byproduct of burning fossil fuels. So that nitrous oxide goes up into the atmosphere. Where does it end up ultimately?
Going into the water.
It comes back down to Earth, either as dry deposition or wet. And ultimately, some of it's going to end up in the water. So, let's see, there's one other thing too I think we're forgetting. Oh, I know what it is. One of the things that we could have done that we didn't do because I messed up.
Put it on
There's a golf course here, which it's hard to tell. That flag sort of gives it away. But there's a golf course here. And look, a nice suburban area. Well, how do they keep that golf course nice and green and weed-free?
fertilizer
And
pesticides.
herbicides, yes. So what we maybe should have done is sprinkled a little bit of this strawberry powder on top to show the herbicides coming down and getting into the water as well. Because I think, once again, a little... And then the middle tank here is going to get 5, mostly just oysters. There might be a barnacle or 2 on some of these. 5 oysters. And then this tank will get 5 oysters and all their things that are attached. So when I pull an oyster up out of the bay, it often looks like this rather than this, okay? So oysters and friends, and in this case, this time of the year, it's mostly mussels and barnacles. In another couple months, when the water gets really cold, these things will be covered with these things called sea squirts.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, or tunicates, but I like the sea squirts. And all of these friends are filter feeders, just like the oyster. So, how many of you, did most all of you grow up in Calvert County?
Yeah.
Remember 5th grade,
Yeah.
the oyster field trip?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of this is going to be old hat to you guys, but the oyster population in the bay has taken a nosedive, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So, this is the amount of oysters that were harvested from the Maryland part of the bay from 40? Yeah, till 1990. So it's a little out of date, but this line would just continue down real low up until the present. So when old John Smith came to the bay, there were huge numbers of oysters in the bay. He was freaked out because he thought he was going to puncture his boats when he ran across some of these oyster reefs that were in the bay. So he didn't go far in his big ships. He'd set out in smaller boats to explore north in the bay because he was so freaked out by the oyster reefs. So look at this graph. Let's just take a look at the numbers for just a minute. So we have this peak time of harvest. It's like the late 1800s. Why all of a sudden do we see this big increase? What was happening historically at that same time? What was being developed in our civilization? Yeah, the Industrial Revolution, yes. So we developed steam engines and so forth and so on, so it increased our capability of harvesting oysters. Up until that time, it was all hand, either with a tong, big long shafted tong, or sailboat. You know, they'd pull a dredge behind a sailboat. But then once they got the motor going, they were really able to go in and plunder. No, they were able to harvest a lot of oysters. So let's look at the actual numbers for a minute. So for about 10 years, it looks like, we were harvesting, I'm going to round it off and say 15 million bushels. A bushel holds about 300 oysters. So somebody do the math. What's 15 million times 300? 4.5 billion? I think it's 4.5 billion. I think I'm right. I did this on a calculator. That's the only reason I know. Okay, so for 10 years, just in Maryland, we were taking 4.5 billion oysters out of the bay every year. That's a lot of oysters. And you can see that harvest was not sustainable for very long, and we took a nosedive. So, who cares? What's the big deal? You know, I mean, we made a lot of money off oysters. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Why should we worry about the number of oysters that we took out?
They're the filters of the bay.
That's called a polykeep. Polykeep worms. Let me just find it here. So, part of the story, the other part of the story besides how many we took out was the difference in the size of the oyster. So when John Smith came, the average size of an oyster was 10 inches. Today, the average size of an oyster is 3. This guy can filter a lot more water than this guy. So there were a lot more oysters and they were a lot bigger. So the filtration capacity in the bay was huge, and now it's minuscule. Why? Here's another sort of weird question. Why is the average size of an oyster 3 inches today rather than 4, 5, 6? Why 3? Yes, sir.
People are hungry.
And
Eat 'em.
what's the legal size to harvest them?
3 inches.
Hey, you knew that one, didn't you? Excellent, very good. Yeah, so as soon as an oyster gets to be this size, you can all go out and harvest X number of bushels of oysters because you're a Maryland resident. So, but it has to be 3 inches or bigger.
So if we don't harvest them, will they continue to grow to the 10-inch capacity, or do they stop growing?
Some of them will. Yes. So, I mean, look at some of these oysters. I
Yeah,
mean,
I was gonna say those
I
are.
mean, that
They
oyster's
work
a lot
now.
bigger. So yeah,
So
they
that one,
will.
like, wasn't harvested.
They will. It's just the likelihood is much less.
Okay.
Yeah. And then there's one other factor too that plays into this 3 magic number. There are a couple diseases that have come into the bay that affect oyster diseases. One of them is called dermo. And dermo, the way it works is a baby oyster is called a spat. It's about the size of a nickel or a dime. And usually the way the disease works is it will infect a baby oyster, but it won't kill the oyster for about 3 years. So it gets infected as a baby, and the disease takes about 3 years to ultimately kill the oyster. Well, an oyster grows an inch a year. So after 3 years, it's 3 inches. If it was diseased, it would die.
What
Okay.
did they look like?
Hmm?
Could you imagine?
Microscopic. Tiny little
It's not
thing.
like something you could visit on, like.
No, it's time microscopic. Okay, what else? Oh, so importance of oysters in the bay. When John Smith came into the bay, look how clear the water used to be. Because all the particles that were floating in the water, most of them were phytoplankton. And they mostly got eaten. Oh, but what does it look like now? Oh, God. So imagine an aquarium. You have an aquarium at home. Your filter goes out. What happens to your aquarium? It starts looking like this, right? So the oyster is an incredibly important animal in this estuary. And we're trying to restore its population. Another way that we're helping to restore it is many people are starting to become oyster farmers. They're growing oysters rather than harvesting the wild oyster. So, there are a lot of different things that we're trying to do to promote the increase of oysters in the bay. Okay, one more thing. Oyster reefs as a habitat. Really dynamic habitat. These animals are just a handful of the animals that live in relation to an oyster reef. These are just a handful of the little fish that live within the confines of an oyster reef. If I want to go bottom fishing, I go fishing over an oyster reef because that's where the bigger fish are congregating because of the food that's available to them. Incredibly important habitat. So, you were convinced in 5th grade, right, that oysters were important? Okay,
Yes.
good. I will say no more.
Okay.
Okay, let's go and get this thing rolling.